In this video, we have a singular goal. That is to create some more interesting test data to work with. Right now, we create a user and set them up in the database. That allows us to test things like the login functionality. We want to make sure we do something similar with tasks, so we can test those other endpoints as well. Now, what does that mean for us? It means we need to create some new data right inside of here. And we're going to make some modifications to set up database to get those tasks actually created. The first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is load in the task model up above. So right here, const task equals, I'll go ahead and use require, loading in that model .. then its source, models task, and down below, we'll go ahead and create a few different pieces of data. I'm going to create a couple of tasks, and we'll even go ahead and create a second user we could play around with. Let's get started with that second user right here. I'm going to take everything for the first user, our two variables. Down below, what I'm going to do is just paste them, changing some of the information. So for the second one, I'll have user2 ID, then the object user2, and down below where we reference the ID, we want to make sure to grab user2 ID here, and when we create the JWT, and then we can just update some of the data. So as an example, I could use Andrew as the name, then andrew@example.com, and I could change the password as well. I'll use something like my house 099, then I'll toss in some special characters as well. So now we have a second user that we could introduce into the database. Down below, we'll go ahead and do just that. We take this line, we duplicate it, and we just change which user we're saving. We go from user1 over to user2. So now we have two users in the database, allowing us to create a more real-world scenario for our test cases. Down below, we can see that one of our test suites has indeed failed, should sign up a new user. I'm actually already using that email, so I'll switch this up to something else. I'll use Jess as the name and then jess@example.com as the email for that test user. I don't believe I've used this, and I haven't. Down below, things are working. Now with this in place, we're going to go ahead and create some tasks for our users, and we'll use those when writing our test cases. Right here, I'll go ahead and create a new constant called task1, and we'll set this up as an object. Now we are going to define our own ID so we can make use of that in our test cases. There's no need to create it as a standalone variable like we did with users. The only reason we did that is because we needed the value in two different places. Down below, we can simply create the ID right on the object. So right here, that is new mongoose.T types .O object I ID. Now that we have that in place, we can go ahead and set up the other task data we need. I'll go ahead and set up the description. So right here, the description for our task. So we have our task model. We have to provide all of this data. The description for this one could be something like first task, and we could set completed equal to false. And then we also have to go ahead and set up owner. So right here, I'm going to set owner equal to the ID of one of my two users up above. Right here, I'll just use user1 ID. I could also use user1._ID, both are identical. So right here, we have a task1, then down below, we'll end up creating a couple of other tasks. Now this task isn't being saved to the database just yet, and that's okay. Down below, I'm going to copy task1, and I'm going to convert that over to task2. I still want to generate my ID, and I'll change the description to something like second task. And for this one, I'll set it to be true in terms of its completed value, and I'll leave this one for user1. Now we'll create just one more by duplicating this object a second time. Down below, this is going to be task3. We'll leave the ID. I'll change the description to third task, and I can leave the completed value at true or false, either one works. And we'll set owner equal to user2.id. So now we have a couple of users and each have tasks, giving us some real-world data to use. Down below, all we need to do is update setup database to actually delete the existing tasks and add these three into the mix. So down below, I will use await with task. And right here, using delete many, exactly like I did on the line above for users. Then down below, where we create the users, we will create all three tasks. I'll define a new one, task 1, calling the save function. I can then take this line and paste it 2 times down below. So we save task 1, then task 2. Whoops, I had some extra characters in there. And then after task 2, that would be task 3. Excellent. Now with this in place, there's no need to make any changes to our test suites. They are automatically going to use all of the new changes we've made. Now if we rerun things, everything should be passing, and it is right here. We still have 11 passing test cases. Now that we have this more interesting data though, we can take advantage of it over inside of our task test suite, and that's exactly what we're gonna do. Down below, this is gonna be a challenge for you to knock out on your own. Right here are the challenge comments. You're gonna write a single test case for get tasks. You're going to ensure that when you fetch the tasks for a given user, you only get those users' tasks back. So right here, you're going to first create the test case and use request to make a request for all tasks for user 1. Then you're going to assert the correct status code, and you're also going to check the length of the response array is 2. So over in db.js, how many tasks does user 1 have? They have 2. That's exactly what I should be getting back. If I'm getting back less, we have a problem. If I'm getting back more, we also have a problem because this should not be returned as a task owned by user 1. It's owned by user 2. Now, once you have that assertion in place, you're going to test your work by running the test case, and you should go from 11 passing tests to 12. So right here, take some time to knock that one out, test your work, and when you're done, come back and click play. How'd that go? Let's kick things off by calling the test function and providing a name. Should fetch user tasks. We'll set up our function as an asynchronous function, and down below, we'll kick things off by making that request. So const response will store the response. I will await the call to request passing in app. Then we'll set up .get. This is a get request to the following endpoint, /tasks. Now, if we were testing one of our options, we could provide those here, such as only getting tasks back that are completed or incomplete, or getting them back in a specific order or a specific page. Right here, though, we just wanted everything, and then down below, we'll make sure to set up authentication. So .set, setting up authorization, providing the correct value, that is bearer, followed by the token user1.tokens, grabbing the first one and accessing that token property. Then we're going to use send to send it off. Now in this case, there's no need to provide a request body, so I'm not going to provide any arguments right here. And finally, I'll add the call to expect on to assert the status code is a 200. Now we want to make sure that the length of that response is 2. So if you forget exactly what your data comes back as, it's okay if you need to look into the router file. For example, I could go into the task router, I could find that specific endpoint, and I could see what sort of structure I'm getting back right here. I can see I'm getting back an array. That means over inside of my test suite, I can set up the correct assertion. What I'm going to do is expect something about response.body. I'm going to expect its length. I'll access the length property to equal the following number, the number 2. If it's 2, great. If it's not, we have a problem. Now we can remove our challenge comments down below and actually test things out. We should have those 12 passing test cases right here. That is exactly what we end up getting. So now we have more interesting test data, allowing us to write test cases like this, where we fetch data for a specific user and make sure that's all we get back. Now let's work through a second challenge of a similar nature. Down below, you're going to test the security of the delete task operation. So you're going to attempt to have the second user delete the first task. Now, the second user is not the owner of the first task, so we would expect that this operation would fail. Now, in order to get this done, you will need to export some stuff from db.js that is currently not exported, all of the new stuff we created. Once you have that loaded into this file, you're actually going to send off the request trying to delete that first task as the second user. Then you're going to assert you get the correct failure status code, and you'll assert that that first task is still in the database. It should not have been deleted. Finally, you'll test your work by saving the test suite and looking for 13 passing test cases down below. So take some time to knock that one out. You can create the new test case right here. When you're done, come back and click play. All right, how'd that go? I'm gonna kick things off by exporting the new items we created over in db.js. Now we could export just what we need, for example, something like task 1 so we can get its ID, but I'll go ahead and export all 3 tasks as well as the data for that second user. That means down below, we're gonna add some more stuff right on here. We'll have user 2 ID, then we'll have user 2. We'll have a task 1, task 2, and finally task 3, making sure the other file can access anything that it might need. Now we can go ahead and save this one and load in just what we actually need over here. So we want the second user to delete the first task, which means I need both of those pieces of data. Up above, when we're actually, when we're destructuring an object, we typically want to keep it on one line if you're just grabbing a couple of things. But if you find yourself grabbing quite a few things, you can go ahead and break that onto multiple lines like this, a very common thing to do. And with this in place, we can now easily grab other things we would like as well. For example, I can grab user 2 ID. I can go ahead and grab user 2, and I'll grab my tasks as well, even if we're not using them right now. Task 1, task 2, and task 3. And with this in place, we're now ready to actually create that test case. Down below, let's do just that by calling test a third time in this file. Right here, test should not delete other users' tasks. You might have picked a different name, that's perfectly fine. I'll set this up as an async function, and then we'll go ahead and actually make the request. So as that second user, we want to delete the very first task. I'm gonna kick things off by creating my response variable and awaiting my call to request. I'll pass in the app, then we'll go ahead and set up the specific type of HTTP request we're making. This is using delete with the following path. Now the path is going to include the ID of that first task. So I could use a regular string and use concatenation with the plus operator, or I could use a template string. Either approach is perfectly fine. That is /tasks/ the task ID. Right here, that for me will be the following, that is task1 ._ID. Then down below, we want to make sure we're authenticated as that second user. So I'll be setting up the authorization header with the value bearer followed by the token for that second user. Right here, that would be user2.tokens, grabbing the first one by its index and then grabbing the individual JSON web token. Then we'll go ahead and send this one off to the server. Now for this case, there's no need to send any data. So we can move right along to our expect call. And if there is no task found with that ID owned by that user, we know we get a 404 back. So that takes care of everything in steps 1 and 2. Next up, I want to make sure that task is still in the database down below. What I'm going to do is try to fetch it. Const task equals. I'll use task and find by ID to fetch it. I have task1._ID. Now I am going to go ahead and use await with that. And then we're just going to make an assertion that we actually got a task back. So I will expect task not to be null. Perfect. Now with this in place, we're all done. We are setting up everything, including our assertions. I can remove the challenge comments as all there is left to do is to test our work. Right here, we can see the first test suite has passed, and then the second, we have 13 passing test cases. Now at this point, we have a pretty good test suite in place. In the next lesson, we're going to wrap up this section on testing by going over some other test cases you could now write based off of what you now know. I'm excited to get to that, so I'll see you in the next one.